Good morning. My name is LaVere Alexander, and I am the Chief Strategy Officer for California Forward. And on behalf of the organization, I want to welcome you to the Building Equitable Economies, California's sustainable and resilient climate future. So, as I said, I am the Chief Strategy Officer for California Forward. And I also have here my colleague, Patrick Atwater, who is a Senior Research Analyst for California Forward. And we're going to jump into the presentation in just a moment. However, I want to do a few things here. I want to do some housekeeping so that we're all on the same page. The webinar is being recorded. So speakers, just be aware of that, as well as the audience. Know that we need you to keep your mics muted when not speaking so that we don't have any interference. The webinar will conclude with a question and answer segment. So please submit your questions to the panelists in the questions panel. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to be going very quickly here today because we don't have a lot of time to set a lot of this up. We have a jam-packed event for you today. I want to make sure that we have time for the presenters. But I do want to make sure that you understand who we are, California Forward, and how we operate. We strive to create an ecosystem of equity so that all people within California have access to the California dream, and are able to participate in this idea, an actual plan of shared prosperity. We start with the evidence through the CDI, which anchors all of our work. It allows us to make sure that we are rooted in evidence-based public policy. We also are moving this work forward through the California Stewardship Network, which is comprised of California Economic Development Corporations, as well as community foundations and other organizations that are all focused on the triple bottom line. They're focused on balancing economic opportunity, and racial equity, and environmental sustainability. We lift everything up that we're working on throughout the year with our work groups at the California Economic Summit. We put forth agendas and policy recommendations that throughout the year, we will advance through the C4, our California Action Fund. That's how it all comes together. And since we are an organization that is rooted in evidence-based public policy, I'm going to pivot to Patrick at this time so that he can frame up the presentations today and make sure that we are looking at all of the information that's going to be presented today through the lens of data that is tracked and measured through the CDI. Patrick, you want to take over now?
Thank you for that kind introduction. And we just wanted to give you a quick data bite to set the stage. As you see on the screen before you, California needs to increase its rate of decarbonization by approximately 250% over the next decade in order to meet its ambitious climate goals. This is particularly key as we look and know from the California Dream Index that we've seen dramatic disparities in regional and racial equity over the previous decade, and that's despite a booming economy that saw California grow from the world's 9th to the world's 5th largest economy. And this is particularly key when we look at the larger context that California is approximately 2% of global carbon emissions. And, you know, two key points. One, that when we see things like domestic migration and particularly lower income California the state, we're going to higher carbon states, that doesn't help us with the global picture. And two, we really need to truly pioneer a model so that, you know, we can show the way a decarbonized economy can work for everyone, and that the, you know, the rest of the nation and the rest of the world really wants to emulate. So with that, I will hand it back over to you, LaVere.
Thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Kate Meese. She is our partner and friend, and she's going to be serving as the moderator for this webinar. She's going to guide you through the presentations. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate. Kate, you have the floor.
Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be part of this conversation. It's certainly a timely conversation between Earth Day and the Global Climate Summit. I know a lot of us have been assessing our progress and thinking about climate action, particularly over the last couple weeks. As part of that climate summit, President Biden pledged to cut US greenhouse gas pollution in half by 2030, which is really exciting because it's nearly double the target set by the Obama administration. But the most current climate science tells us that we actually need to go further. We need to achieve carbon neutral by 2030. And we know this will require significant leadership at all levels. And subnational leadership in particular will be critical to achieving those goals. Cities consume 2/3 of the global energy supply and generate 3/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. They're both uniquely vulnerable to climate change and also the best place to really scale rapid change and innovate. And that's what we're seeing across California and the nation, local governments and regional leaders turning urban centers into laboratories, reimagining the entire urban fabric to be greener, more efficient, more equitable, and more resilient to the impacts of climate change that we're already feeling. And given that we aren't on track to even meet our less ambitious climate goals, it will be critical that we prioritize adaptation and resilience in the face of drought, wildfires, heat, and other increasing climate impacts. And part of that is going to require a dramatic shift in both our investments and our policy landscape to meet the urgency of the challenge. And we have a really unique opportunity, a once in a generation opportunity to do that right now. If you look at the massive amount of funds coming in from the Recovery Act, we're anticipating a future infrastructure stimulus that will be an opportunity to make massive investments. And California has a $15 billion budget surplus. So we have a very unique opportunity to move from the type of incrementalism that has plagued this massive challenge, the climate challenge, to make significant and groundbreaking changes in climate equity and resilience. And we know that these climate challenges, like wildfires, cuts across jurisdictional boundaries. So partnerships across regions are going to be really, really critical. And we've seen how interconnected we are as we address these challenges. So really excited to hear about some of those great regional partnerships from Rachel and Catherine. We also know that we'll need that critical state leadership and support as well. That has become crystal clear in the last 4 years as California has stepped in to fill the vacuum of federal leadership. And now that we have that federal leadership again, we know that federal government is going to be critical in making investments that can speed up the pace and scale of our work. So really excited to hear from New and Tara and from Steve about some of those state and federal opportunities. And finally, I know for me, the thing that keeps me inspired to continue to do this work is the bold and courageous actions of youth, of the young people that we've seen rise up around the world. So very pleased to be able to, later on in this conversation, introduce the Young Leaders Advisory Council. So we've got a great list of speakers, and I want to go ahead and jump right into our first couple speakers who will be talking about regional collaboration around climate adaptation. So with that, I will turn it over to Rachel and Catherine.
Hi, thank you, Kate. My name is Rachel Couch. I am a project manager at the State Coastal Conservancy, and I am a climate lead in our Central Coast program, and I'm going to introduce the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, and then hand it over to my colleague, Catherine, to talk a little bit about one of our key initiatives that we're working on. But just a little bit about the State Coastal Conservancy. We're a non-regulatory state agency focused on funding voluntary conservation projects that advance the vision and goals of the California Coastal Act to protect and improve natural lands and waterways, and to help people get to and enjoy the outdoors and sustain the local economies along the California coast. As part of that, my Coastal Conservancy position, I serve as chair this year for ARCA, the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation. And as you know, as the Conservancy, we applaud the state's cutting-edge efforts to accelerate, mitigating climate impacts through greenhouse gas reductions. but we also have worked to over the past decade to assist local and regional efforts to adapt the coast, both the built and natural assets of the coast, to the changes anticipated by climate impacts. And building resilience on the ground is key to that effort, as we are now experiencing those impacts in real time and at an accelerated pace. So ARCA is a statewide network bringing together leading voices and thinkers in climate adaptation in California, and provides a critically needed infrastructure for the exchange of best practices and replicable strategies, support for regional climate collaboratives to align and accelerate local adaptation policies and strategies, and coordination between state, regional, and local entities. At our core, ARCA focuses on advancing regional approaches to adaptation to address landscape level impacts of climate change. And as these impacts continue to worsen and adaptation practices evolve to meet community needs, ARCA helps to foster knowledge exchange and build mutual support for equitable and swift action. I should have said next slide. Sorry, forgot about the next slide part. Let me just find my place here real quick. ARCA is a coalition program of the Local Government Commission, Kate's outfit, and the Governor's Office of Planning and Research serves as ARCA's state liaison. ARCA represents 7 regions throughout California, which in total encompass over 80% of the state's population, as well as several leading organizations and institutions working to advance adaptation in California and beyond. Together, ARCA members work to enhance public health, protect natural systems, build economies, and create resilient, livable communities throughout California. By sharing best practices and resources, identifying strategies to overcome key barriers and challenges, and conducting joint campaigns and projects, ARCA members effectively bolster their individual and collective efforts. So I just, want to emphasize that this holistic work and approach is multi-sectoral, and it's also attempting to achieve multiple benefits in that triple bottom line that we all talk about. Of social and racial equity, economic recovery, and public health, as well as environmental and climate solutions. So I believe economic recovery can be achieved as we seek solutions to our climate challenges. So now I'll hand it over to Catherine, and she'll talk a little bit more in depth about one of our initiatives, Embedding Equity and Adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for your introduction of ARCA. Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Foster, and I'm a project manager with the Local Government Commission and also the coordinator for ARCA. Today, we'll be giving a brief overview of our most recent initiative, Embedding Equity in Adaptation. As we're all aware, equity is often the focus of climate change conversations and essential to creating resilient communities. However, embedding equity in adaptation efforts continues to be a challenge. That is not to say that this work has not been prioritized. We have seen great efforts throughout the state and beyond to prioritize inclusive community engagement and relationship building with frontline communities. But the deeper work of dismantling systems of oppression has really yet to begin. While ARCA has been an advocate for equitable adaptation since our network first formed, we know that we can and must do more to intentionally and strategically embed equity in all aspects of the adaptation process, practice, and field. We also understand that equity in all forms is essential to a resilient and just recovery effort, as Rachel mentioned. This new initiative is funded by the Climate Resilience Fund and focuses on turning our attention inwards to our members, our governance structures, and our role in California's broader adaptation community. A single project will never be sufficient, as we all are aware, but our hope is to leverage this project to continue our work in shaping a more equitable adaptation movement. Next slide, please. The project includes 3 main phases: learning, institutionalizing, and implementing. Phase 1 is our learning stage, and this includes an ARCA member equity assessment, learning seminars, and peer learning circles. So ARCA members recently completed a self-evaluation to assess their current awareness, understanding, and adoption of various equity principles and practices. The results of this assessment established a baseline and revealed key gaps and opportunities among our membership. We are now in the middle of designing a series of learning seminars to deepen our members' understanding of equity principles and strategies, as well as a series of peer learning circles for adaptation practitioners to exchange ideas and build mutual support for embedding equity in their own practices and organizations. Results from the equity assessments recently completed will be used to identify the topics of both the learning seminars and peer learning circles, and we're hoping to launch those in summer 2021. Our next phase is the institutionalizing phase. So we're working to update ARCA's governance procedures and guiding principles for adaptation and collaboration to integrate equity into the very foundation of how we operate and make decisions. These updates will inform a set of recommendations for ARCA's regional climate collaboratives that outline the steps to take in order to adopt more equitable governance models. We will also update our Adaptation Capability Advancement Toolkit, that's the ADAPT-CA toolkit on the screen, and that will provide clear roadmaps to help adaptation practitioners build their capabilities for equitable adaptation processes, skills, and practices. And our final phase is the implementing phase. In this phase, we'll be working with a consultant to provide technical assistance, support the implementation of equity strategies throughout our regional collaboratives, and create case studies that detail key steps, challenges, and lessons learned along the way. We'll be organizing a public webinar in October to share the outcomes of this initiative, as well as ARCA's next steps for continuing our own journey towards equity. Next slide, please, and I pass it back to Rachel.
Thank you, and please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, and we'll be available after the speakers for questions then too. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rachel and Catherine, and do encourage folks to put any questions you may have in the question box, and we'll hope to get to those at the end of the webinar. So really exciting work you guys are doing over at ARCA. I think it's going to be really useful for regions across the state. So great to have you all as pioneers leading in these efforts. As Rachel mentioned, OPR has been a state affiliate and a liaison and a really critical partner. And that work between regions and the state agencies is hugely important for adaptation and resilience. So with that, I would love to turn it over to Newsom.
Hello, I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you so much for the invitation to join and to be on this exciting panel and to join all the other speakers here. So I'm Newsom. I'm Deputy Director for Climate Resilience in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Next slide, please. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about the work that we're doing through our adaptation program, the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program at OPR. Before I dive in, I will just give a little bit of context for those who may not know who OPR is. We are in the Governor's Office and serve the Governor and Cabinet on long-range planning and other issues affecting the state, including climate as well as just transition and resilience work. We also are the state's land use planning entity, so work in close partnership with our local and regional governments across the state and other important partners to really support land use planning issues. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus in here today, as I mentioned, on ICAR and the role and our role in state government around resilience and adaptation, as well as our work to integrate and prioritize equity across all the adaptation work that we're doing. So for context, our program was created through statute. So this is one of our statutory roles through OPR, really to serve as the hub for interagency and state coordination and policy alignment across climate adaptation and resilience. And what that looks like in practice is both coordinating across and with our state agency partners, really driving towards better alignment, but also working in partnership with our regional, local government partners, tribes, as well as communities across the state, as well as the private sector, really looking to coordinate and align both across scales, but across sectors, driving towards a much more integrated approach on adaptation and resilience. I want to highlight two priorities that drive and inform our work through the enabling statute. Actually, we are required and called to prioritize equity across our work, really driving towards equitable outcomes on resilience and adaptation, recognizing we as a state will not be resilient if we are leaving communities behind and are not centering equity in all the work we're doing. The other priority that drives and informs our approach is the integrated in our title of our program, which is really driving towards a more integrated approach and framework on climate at better integrating mitigation and adaptation as equal sides to the same coin as the state's approach on climate. There are two programmatic components. The first is an adaptation clearinghouse, and the second is an advisory council. I'll briefly talk about both of those as I go through the next slides here. Next slide. So with that context, I wanted to just quickly mention our advisory council. And, I want to a quick step back and just say, when we are talking about resilience in our office, we take a very broad view, really looking at how we are approaching resilience across sectors and systems, and recognizing that, we really need to be thinking about resilience across built, natural, social systems. It is not just one of those areas that we need to be focusing on. So our council, which again is part of our statutory directive, really helps us bring together different and critical stakeholder perspectives and voices that need to be at the table to bring this systems approach to light. And this is, I just want to flag this, our advisory council really is the only state body that is specifically charged with focusing on adaptation and resilience. Next slide. So one of the early and foundational pieces of our work when we launched the program in 2017 and working in partnership with our council was to chart a vision for what we mean by a resilient California. What is it we are working towards? Back in 2017, resilience and adaptation was even quickly emerging and a new area for a lot of folks. And so we really wanted to do this foundational work to chart a vision. But fundamental to this approach was also recognizing that a vision alone will not ensure we are driving on equitable outcomes. We needed principles to guide how we get there, recognizing the process is equally as important as the outcome itself. And within that, our council worked to ensure that equity and working towards equitable processes and outcomes was fundamental to the principles in terms of how we get to that resilience outcome. The third piece to this is recognizing that we also need to better understand who is vulnerable to climate and why, recognizing that there are underlying factors that are driving vulnerability and risk. Next slide. And I see Rachel here on my screen. That might be an indication I need to move ahead here quickly. So one of the things that came through after we developed that definition for vulnerable communities that was really fundamental to better building our capacity to drive on resilience was actually developing guidance on how do you make that definition actionable in your climate adaptation work. And the guidance here that is shown on the screen, just a screenshot of the guidance we issued with a link to that, is specifically targeted towards local jurisdictions, really wanting to help local jurisdictions as they're developing adaptation and resilience plans and thinking about investments to be have the resources and guidance to make sure that those investments and plans are supporting communities that are most impacted and people that are most impacted by climate impacts. So that's what our guidance is working to do, is make that definition more actionable. One of the other things I wanted to flag here too is, as we were developing this guidance and thinking about vulnerability in an adaptation context, we wanted to make the connection and provide guidance on how to also link that work with the environmental justice priorities within communities, and specifically showing where there are opportunities to align work on identifying vulnerability from climate risk to the requirements that local governments have on incorporating environmental justice into their general plans. So there's a little screenshot. I don't expect anybody to be able to read that here on the slide here today, but a screenshot of a crosswalk table that we did to identify where there are opportunities for local governments to really integrate work on environmental justice and climate risk and vulnerability in their general plans. So flagging that here as a resource for folks on the line. Next slide. Great. So kind of stepping back a little bit from the work that we were had done, kind of the foundational work, and kind of stepping up a little bit in here to 2021, recognizing kind of that foundational work around setting, charting a vision, guiding principles to inform how we get there, providing resources on how to make, actionable our understanding of vulnerability and risk in our planning. Our next stage of work is to develop a vulnerable communities platform, which is the first bullet here. Where we are driving with this is actually trying to bring together the wealth of data and information and many different platforms that are out there to an integrated hub where users can actually access the data and information to better understand who is vulnerable to future climate risk, and again, that really important question of why. So we're just launching this project now. We're very excited and really recognize that this is going to serve a really important, serve to fill a really important gap that's out there, both at the state level as well as within communities across the state. The other two things I just wanted to flag very quickly is we are updating, working in partnership with the Natural Resources Agency to update the state's adaptation strategy this year. So I want to flag for folks that that is another really important opportunity for people to engage and help us at the state level make sure that as we're charting a more strategic framework on adaptation and resilience, that we are embedding and integrating equity across all of the work that we're doing there. And then last, just a quick note that, one of our main priorities and focus as well this year is really thinking about how do we make sure communities have the information to guide science-informed policy making. Again, really looking at how we make all this information actionable on the ground. So next slide. I think my last slide here, yes, just really quickly, I just wanted to flag that we also have our adaptation clearinghouse. This clearinghouse is really intended to support a community of practice across the state, and just we've included the URL here, resilienceca.org, but wanted to point folks to this resource. There are over 900 different resources linked and included in here. We also have worked in partnership with Cal OES, the Office of Emergency Services, to integrate the adaptation planning guide as an interactive guidance tool throughout the clearinghouse. And specifically within that, a lot of great resources around how to embed equity and equitable processes in adaptation planning. So really encourage folks to look at that as another resource for the work that you all are doing across the state. And then next slide. Just want to say thank you, and I've included my email here, so happy to connect with anybody who has follow-up questions. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kate.
Thanks, Nu and Tara. You've been such a great partner in this space. We're so lucky to have you in California and to be in a state that has put so much thought and intention and capacity behind resilient and embedding equity. So thanks so much for your leadership. And with that, I am pleased to turn it over to another partner, Steve Frisch, who's going to talk to us about some of the federal stimulus and infrastructure funding opportunities. Steve?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for doing this webinar to California Forward. I'm the president of the Sierra Business Council, which is an ARCA collaborative serving the Sierra Nevada region. And we're also a California Stewardship Network member, which is an affiliate, kind of the regional boots on the ground of California Forward. And I wanted to talk for just a couple minutes about kind of the historic opportunity we have right now to align state and federal objectives around some of these things. So this is probably potentially the most significant shift in federal policy that we've seen around these issues coming from the Biden-Harris administration since the 1960s, which I think is a really important moment for us to reflect on what could be done towards meeting that goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. And I think it's really important for us to keep in mind that this represents a truly radical departure from kind of previous approaches around both economic stimulus and investments in infrastructure, families, and kind of the future of the country. The previous kind of strategy has been tax cuts and essentially distributing funding to businesses and primarily wealthy individuals, whereas the current strategy, first through the American Rescue Plan and then through the American Jobs Plan and the American Family Plan, represents kind of an investment in people and families, and with a specific lens on equity and climate adaptation. And I think that's a truly radical departure. This is really the first time since Lyndon Johnson's Great Society that we've seen a specific focus on both social and physical infrastructure improvement at the same time. Next slide, please. So I think one of the things that's really important for us to remember is that we need to be looking at these proposals coming through the Biden administration as a package. And that package includes really three parts. The first was the American Rescue Plan, which has already passed, which was $1.9 trillion. The second is the American Jobs Plan that is in legislative language right now and is $2.25 trillion. And the third is the American Families Plan that was put on the table last night in Biden's speech address to the country, which is $1.9 trillion. And between these three proposals, this represents roughly a $6 trillion investment in social and fiscal infrastructure across the country. This is the first time that these investments are being made with a specific equity lens, which I think is particularly important. So you'll see in all three of the proposals as they've been put forward that there are specific inclusions for equity and tearing down some of these racial barriers and barriers to progress that have been made in the past. And this is also the first time that such a package of plans has been put together with a specific climate lens, driving to meeting that 50% reduction by 2030 goal. Next slide, please. And I think what's really important as well is this represents a historic opportunity for us to align state objectives with federal funding coming down the pike with both this equity and this climate adaptation lens. We are in a pretty good position with California representation, both in the vice presidency and in the Speaker of the House, for California to compete effectively for many of the funds that have been set aside. But I wanted to highlight just a couple of the things in the Biden infrastructure plan that are specifically focused on equity. First, 40% of all of the energy and climate funding is specifically set aside for disadvantaged communities, which I think is truly a kind of a landmark. There's also specific set-asides in the $213 billion in affordable housing that is targeted to disadvantaged communities. There's a separate $50 billion fund for climate adaptation and resilience of infrastructure. There's a $25 billion fund for reconnecting neighborhoods. This is looking at the urban planning process and the neighborhoods that have been intentionally segregated through public policy and creating opportunities for reconnection. There's a $25 billion fund for child care facilities and improvement of child care facilities across the country, and that includes a specific set aside for equity within the child care fund. And that's before we get into the tax credit advantages and other things that have been created in both the American Recovery Plan and the American Family Plan that was announced last night. There's $101 billion in water system upgrades with a specific focus on reducing all of the lead pipes in the United States in the next 10 years, which is truly kind of a remarkable change. There's a $10 billion set aside for a civilian, excuse me, for a civilian climate corps. Excuse me one second. For a civilian climate corps with the idea of engaging young people in climate adaptation. There's also $100 billion in workforce development with a significant component of it specifically targeted to underserved communities. And $5 billion in a rural partnership program. So I think one of the really critical questions for us as regional leaders is, how can we take advantage of this historic opportunity to align state and federal priorities in order to drive these programs down to the local level? That's what Sierra Business Council is really focused on as a policy advocacy organization. And I think it creates an opportunity in each of our regions to begin directing funding specifically to meeting many of these equity objectives. But of course, the last two of these plans, the American Infrastructure or Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, have not passed yet. So it's going to be kind of up to us to continue to exert the pressure to pass these two plans in order to secure this $6 trillion investment in our social and physical infrastructure as a down payment towards what we need to do in the future. And with that, I will hand it over.
Thanks, Steve. Obviously, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here with that level of investment. So thanks for walking us through that. And at this point, it's my pleasure to turn it over to the Young Leaders Advisory Council. So I would like to introduce Eleanor, Radha, and Simran to take it away for us.
Thank you so much, Kate. So hi, everyone. My name is Eleanor Arsbecker. I'm a first year at UC Berkeley studying conservation and resource studies. And for this presentation, we'll be touching on the importance of environmental equity and justice from a youth perspective. So to kick us off and give some context, we'd like to share about our experiences with this issue. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So my personal journey with the environmental justice movement has really been about coming from a place of ignorance before I grew into an ally. So when I first got involved in climate activism, I was very much the type of environmentalist who believes that damage from climate change is separate from racial justice movements or feminism. For a while, I thought that intersectionality would weaken our movements rather than strengthen them. I was fortunate enough, luckily, though, to be grounded by the community organizers around me and to come to understand that not only are all of our current social issues so intertwined that we really can't separate them at all, but that also gives us a lot of strength and power to the movements we're a part of. You really can't talk about mitigating climate change without recognizing the importance of women's education. And you definitely can't discuss the impact of environmental degradation without acknowledging how low-income communities and communities of color are disproportionately affected. I think that my experience of entering into activism from a place of ignorance has really shown me the vulnerability that so many of our systems have. When we come from certain backgrounds into spaces of power and influence, our lack of knowledge can lead to very, very tangible effects for other people. So with that being said, I think centering marginalized communities in policy conversations will allow us to adequately address all of our problems and also safeguard those decisions from causing adverse effects down the line.
Hi, my name is Radha Karola. I'm an incoming freshman at Columbia University. And like Elliot, I've always been passionate about stopping the destruction of the environment and very concerned about the well-being of endangered species. But I was pretty oblivious to the toll that toxic environmental practices take on low-income communities and communities of color. Since there's no course on environmental racism in school and I haven't experienced those directly, I had to take the steps and educate myself about the issue and learn how to be a good ally. I realized how important it was to own my own privilege as someone who grew up in a middle-class family, reach out to those communities most affected, and try to uplift those voices. And by practicing these steps, I can support those with personal experience, expertise, and those with creative ideas to help find inclusive solutions to climate change, because we need to bring everyone along to create a truly healthy planet.
Hey everyone, my name is Simran. I'm a current second year at SDSU studying business and political science. So my environmental journey started at the time when the gun control movements and walkout were happening. And I was really thrown into activist spaces where people kept asking me what my issue was. And with all the injustices happening around the world, it was really hard to deem one the most important. And I came to the realization that environmental activism wasn't just about keeping wildlife and forests alive. It was also about people. And so from there, I decided if I was going to dedicate my time to an issue, it was going to be something that encompasses many other issues like environmental activism and environmental justice. So my freshman year of college, I joined my campus's lead sustainability organization. And right off the bat, I was just one or two of people of color. And I thought the only thing I really have in common with these people is that I'm vegan. And fortunately, the leader of the organization remembered my name and made me feel welcome enough. And so I kept coming back and taking on more responsibility. But fast forward 1 year later, and I'm leading that organization and making sure that nobody feels like they aren't welcome in our space. And instead of putting environmental justice in one of many boxes, I've worked to make sure that we take into account Indigenous and POC voices in all of our actions and goals.
Great, thank you, Simran. So now, as we consider roadblocks or challenges to environmental justice, I think it's very important to see the intersection between the scientific and human sides of environmental issues, because as effects of climate change are intensifying, low-income communities and communities of color, as we know, bear the brunt of that damage. And one common example that I can think of specific to California is the wildfires, which they continue to worsen with each passing year, and along with the fire and destruction that they bring, the sheer volume of smoke, which clogs the skies and decreases the air quality to unsafe levels. Then as that smoke seeps into surrounding areas like agricultural fields, migrant workers in the fields are then exposed to toxic air pollutants over prolonged periods of time. And then in addition to damage from natural weather events, frontline communities are exposed to more man-made environmental toxins than whiter, wealthier communities. According to a California Health Report on Pollution, Latinx and Black Californians breathe in 40% more pollution from transportation than white Californians. And not only are people of color more affected, but your income also determines your level of exposure, because that same report tells us that people whose household incomes are less than $20,000 a year and those who do not own a personal vehicle breathe in 20% more pollution. Sadly, our current systems perpetuate the deterioration of the environment and do little to support those communities that are harmed. Families are left without access to clean water or healthy food, which then endangers their health. If the environment damages their health, then they might not be able to go to school or to perform well at their job, which then endangers their future.
Yeah, so if we go to the second slide, as Rada pointed out, the effects of environmental degradation and climate change disproportionately impact communities of color and low-income communities. I do think it's also really important to acknowledge that a lot of the solutions that we propose to climate crises are not accessible to everybody in the same way. We talk about the importance of transitioning to all electric vehicles, but what about families who can't afford to buy a new car and they also don't have access to safe and reliable public transportation? Or we talk about the importance of going vegetarian or eating organic food, but what about people who live in a food desert and they don't have the time or financial ability to change their diets? When we propose solutions to the climate crisis, both smaller personal lifestyle changes, but also broad scale systemic changes, when we do that without thinking about the accessibility or impact of these solutions, we risk harming already vulnerable communities even more. So not only should our solutions to environmental degradation not exacerbate existing inequalities, but we should also be incredibly proactive in designing solutions that close these gaps and promote equity above all.
Yeah, as my fellow presenters spoke on, our most vulnerable communities are the ones that are being affected by these issues of climate change. And to make this even worse, not only are the solutions provided not accessible, but they blame these communities for problems they didn't even create. Is climate change really the fault of someone living in a food desert and can't afford nor take the time out of their day to cook and eat sustainably? Or is it the fault of the corporation that put our people in vulnerable positions in the first place? Things like carbon footprints create a narrative that if everyone rides their bike to work, climate change wouldn't exist, and that's just not true. We shouldn't be blaming everyday people just trying to get by. Yes, it's important to make environmentally conscious decisions on the individual level if possible, but it's not nearly as important as addressing the impact of corporations on environmental disasters. When we draft policy, we must make sure that we remember how skewed this balance of responsibility is, so we don't end up blaming people for their own community's destruction. To speak on steps forward, though, I do see public transportation as key. Marginalized communities have been largely classified as essential workers in the past year. Not only are they the most vulnerable, but also the most necessary, and investing in publicly funded infrastructure like transportation is so important to helping them. Recently, MTS San Diego brought forward a vote to increase rider fares, but these solutions are not adequate. It was struck down after a large public comment push because yes, there needs to be more money going towards public transportation, but the solution isn't paying by rider, it's making these systems publicly funded. Not only does this ease the financial burden of transport away from essential workers and lower income peoples, but it also expands the use of renewable energy. Putting long-term solutions like comprehensive public transportation into action allows for more convenient and affordable options rather than cars and other pollutive forms of transport. We must make it easy and affordable for people to choose a sustainable option.
Great. And another major step to reaching our environmental justice goals is to humanize the problem. As mentioned in our call to action, given the proliferation of misinformation and denial of scientific fact, it is vital to promote widespread climate education. K-12 schools could incorporate environmental justice into their science programs to equip students with the knowledge and resources to make those sustainable and environmentally conscious choices that we're talking about, and also to provide space to develop innovative solutions. Part of that solution must also include responsible management of the environment to prevent and mitigate those natural disasters. Frontline communities feel the most severe impacts of these disasters and are often constantly rebuilding their lives each time disaster strikes. For example, you can build equity with your home, but if your home is wiped out in a tornado, then that wealth that you just built is gone and you don't have the proper insurance to get it back. So the more that we can avoid extreme weather events, the more that people can focus on their education, their professional development, and move forward with their lives. An equitable future is one in which frontline communities must share in the profits of that progress.
Yeah, if we could go to the last slide, please. I think that the most important recommendation that I can give to address all of the issues we spoke on today is to really emphasize the importance of proper representation. Just becoming educated ourselves is not enough. Developing solutions on behalf of instead of with marginalized communities is not enough and also could be really harmful. What we truly need is to create meaningful spaces for low-income communities and communities of color in our policymaking process. We need to be developing channels between frontline communities and political offices. We need to be ensuring that community interests and needs are heard and addressed. So as our Young Leaders Advisory Council call to action points out, building strong and diverse coalitions is really necessary in order to address climate change properly. With this said, I think it's also vital to highlight equity and intersectionality in our policy development. So we need to be active in making sure we're mending historic divides and uplifting frontline communities while we address climate change. You know, I came to understand that this crisis, it's not just about plants or animals or ecological preservation. At its core, this is an issue about people, and our policies need to be aligned with the goal of creating equitable, sustainable, safe, and healthy communities for everyone, not just a few people. Thank you so much.
That was fantastic. Thank you. So inspiring. It's really critical that we remember the need to have climate solutions that are accessible and consider where we put the burden and responsibility of climate action. So thanks so much for that. So we do have a number of questions coming in. I'm going to start with ARCA first and combine a couple of the questions here. So for Rachel and Catherine, can you speak to some of the specific equity standards and best practices that have emerged from the work to date, and some of the unique challenges in working to be more intentional and inclusive around equity?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And then Rachel, if you have additional comments, you can add in. Excuse me, my voice is a little bit. So in terms of the best practices and equity standards, we're still sort of in the working phase of identifying some of those practices. Through the assessment, we have found that folks really just want more information related to sort of funding opportunities and strategies, how to best power share with communities, how to engage more effectively with our community groups in long-term adaptation efforts, and then some of the individual and organizational challenges that come up naturally from working in organizations that are challenged for funding quite often in the equity space. In terms of some of the unique challenges that we've seen, we were very fortunate to receive the Climate Resilience Fund to fund our work, but we know that funding is often a challenge for frontline communities trying to embed equity more generally in the work that they do. So one of the funding challenges that comes up often is that there are equity experts, obviously, throughout the state of California, but they need to be funded and appropriately for the work that they commit to. So with us working on a project, we need to both understand the limitations that may exist already in the space for those equity experts and also seek out better ways to fund them for their time. We are also, for some of the best practices, sort of tie in that a little bit more, we consider ourselves more of a convener to bring people to the table to have these conversations, to identify these best practices. And that's part of the reason why we're bringing on an equity consultant to better help us align some of the work being done at the regional level with the statewide effort and some of the equity resources that have been created. Things like the Green Lining Institute resources and also materials shared by the California Environmental Justice Alliance. Rachel, anything else to add?
Yeah, also in terms of some of the best practices, I'm putting in the chat.
We lost you, Rachel. We lost audio.
Oh, I put in the chat the BayCan, which is the Bay Area's Climate Adaptation Network, their Equitable Adaptation Guide. That's an example of the types of best practices and resources that we're gathering and looking to help us do this work, and also really, through our member survey, really trying to understand the needs out there of our members, but also not just the members that are already involved with ARCA, but potential areas of need or communities of need or organizations that are serving the needs of frontline communities in the regional collaboratives that ARCA represents. So, and in terms of the question around, is our equity work an additional layer or a fundamental reevaluation of the structurally racist impacts of our California's environmental policies? I think it's interesting to think about that in terms of the wildfire example, in that we are now, looking to traditional practices around burning that can create healthy forests and wildfire risk reduction, rather than just preserving forest habitats, which then have become especially fire dangerous in times of drought and high fire risk. And so I think that's the kind of thinking we want to do, which is really looking at how policies have contributed to some of the problems we see now, and how we might look to look back at traditional practices to try to better understand that, how to create that balance. So that's the example that came to mind with that question.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So we have a few questions that came in for New and Tara, and I'll ask to the extent possible to try and keep our answers brief, just because I want to get to all the questions here. So there's a lot of questions around collaboration with other state agencies. So in particular, natural resources around the executive order to protect 30% of lands, public lands and waters by 2030. And then also CAL FIRE and fire safe councils around wildfire risks. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, definitely. We are working in partnership across all of the state partners that were mentioned in those questions. So specifically on the 30 by 30 and the Climate Smart Land Strategy, we are working in close partnership with the Natural Resources Agency, both, as part of the interagency team working on that, but also to make sure that that work is done in complement and aligned with the update to the state adaptation strategy, recognizing all of these pieces need to fit together as one broad framework, recognizing the need to incorporate resilience in our natural systems as part of a broader approach on resilience, recognizing the interconnection that it all has within communities and for people. So we are working in close partnership with them. I'm happy to take a follow-on question offline or connect with anybody around specifics on what that looks like. There is one connection point I would just like to flag, which is the Natural Resources Agency, in implementing the executive order, is developing a platform, a mapping platform, CA Nature. We are working to make sure that that platform is going to be well integrated and aligned with our vulnerable communities platform. So just a quick note on a direct connection point there. In terms of coordinating with CAL FIRE and the fire safe councils and other important partners around wildfire issues, we are absolutely doing that. One thing I would flag is we're just finishing up and released the Wildfire Technical Advice Series, which is part of our General Plan Guideline Technical Advice Series. And that was done in very close coordination with CAL FIRE, Fire Safe Councils, Cal OES, a number of really important partners that are helping to address wildfire risk. And I did notice just a question around coordinating with other states. We are a member of the Pacific Coast Collaborative, so specifically are in conversations with both Oregon and Washington as part of and British Columbia to understand how we can better coordinate and share resources and insight as we're all dealing with just catastrophic wildfires affecting the West. So I think I answered your questions on that. I'll hand it back to you. Please let me know if there's any additional insight I can provide.
Thanks, Tara. And Steve, it looks like you answered this question in the chat, but do you want to just highlight a few of the areas that you thought could have been improved within the Biden's infrastructure plan?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of focus on this issue of like, how do you use urban planning problems to deconstruct the structural racism that has been put in place in both housing policy and employment policy? And, I think if there's a critique of the Biden plan, one piece of it is that it doesn't get quite enough funding into this issue of kind of beginning to reverse that structural racism problem in housing desegregation, that the housing component really could be significantly larger. There's also kind of some discussion about whether or not the tribal and rural lands piece of it has been large enough, or whether that's going to need to be addressed in some sort of public lands bill, or by aligning funding from things like the Land and Water Conservation Fund and the Great America Outdoors Act and other kind of other mechanisms to get to some of these rural land management issues, like reinstituting tribal cultural practices like burning and other things. But I think it's important to note, this is probably only a down payment on what we need to do by 2040. Like, as you noted at the beginning of the meeting, Kate, 50% by 2030 probably isn't enough. So we're going to need to start thinking about these things as, how do we make huge structural investments over time in order to meet actually a carbon negativity goal and begin kind of reversing the damage that we've done to date. And, $6 trillion is a pretty good down payment.
Great, thank you. And then a couple questions for the Young Leaders Advisory Council, but we don't have a ton of time, so real brief. How do folks connect with you guys and your colleagues across the state? And then there's a couple other questions on the chat that hopefully you guys can answer through the chat as we wrap up. But quickly, how do folks connect with the council?
Yeah, really quickly, I'll just say, if you want to learn more about what we do or about the other activist groups that we're connected to, just email Amber at CA. Sorry, I'll spell it out for you. Amber at cafwd.org, and then you can learn more about what we do. And just really quick, we're trying to include those marginalized communities in the work that we do in our own group through our application process, making sure that we focus on equity in that.
Great. Thanks so much to all of our speakers. This has been fabulous. And with that, I will turn it back over to Lavera.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you to all of the presenters. You were wonderful. I always am just blown away by the young leaders. That is a group of just powerhouses that we have been so fortunate to work with at California Forward. So we're going to keep lifting them up because they have so much to say and we all need to hear it. We are so glad that you joined us today for our final installment of this series, but please know that we're going to keep doing this work. We're going to keep having these convenings. So the work is not over. We'll continue to come together throughout the year for additional gatherings. But in the meantime, know that we need your help. We need your help to power this movement. We can't do it alone. So you can do this in a variety of ways. You can join us at the 2021 California Economic Summit. It's going to be held this year in Monterey, November 9th through the 10th. It's a wonderful space to come together with colleagues and get things done. We also need support, financial support. This is good work, hard work, but it's also expensive work. So we need you to donate at cafwd.org/donate and stay engaged. You can do that so many different ways. Sign up for our newsletter and updates, reach out to any of us, and visit our website where you'll get all of the information about connecting with work groups, being a part of the summit, all of the different pieces that comprise California Forward. So visit us at cafwd.org. And if you want to sign up for the newsletter, you can do that there as well, cafwd.org/newsletter. I hope you have a great day and remember to keep pushing this work forward. Take care and be blessed.